Hello, everybody, and welcome along to yet another Farmers Weekly Transition webinar. It is great to have you here. My name is Hugh Broom. When I'm not doing this, I am normally sitting in this very farm office, running a farm in Surrey, and I also present the podcast for Farmers Weekly. Welcome along to today's webinar. Those of you who have not attended a Farmers Weekly webinar before, feel free, please, to input questions and comments into the chat screen, which is, there's a widget on the box where you're watching from, and we will get through as many of those as we can. We have also got a whole load of questions, pages of questions that you've all kindly sent in before this evening's event. We are here to discuss next steps in carbon farming. So it's a pretty broad old church, and it's a pretty broad thing to talk about. So without any ado, I'm going to introduce our panel, or rather I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves. Firstly, let's go to North Wales and Rachel Madley Davis. Rachel, please tell us about yourself and why you're here.
Well, Prandar, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Rachel Madley Davis, and I head up Sustainability and Future Policy at Hubby Cymru, or Meat Promotion Wales. And I'm here because actually we need to start talking more seriously about carbon. We need to start to sort of debunk the myths and understand actually what it really means for us as producers. So I'm really keen to be part of this discussion sort of this afternoon, and yeah, look forward to the questions.
Next, we cross to Thomas Gent from Agreener. Thomas, please introduce yourself and tell us about what you do.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Thomas Gent. I'm a farmer from South Lincolnshire. We've been farming regeneratively on our farm for about 16 years, and I've also been working for Agreener for the past 4 years. So we work with farmers across the UK and Europe to help them quantify their kind of carbon impacts of the practices that they're doing in the field, turn that into a carbon certificate, which is then a tradable asset, obviously has a value on the carbon market should they choose to trade it. And I'm excited to be here to talk about, what we've been doing for the last 4 years and how we've learned and progressed this industry, and then where the industry is going into the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. Stuart Jackson joins us from Lincolnshire. Stuart, you are the Head of Technical Services at UPL. What does that entail doing?
Okay, so yes, good evening, everybody. I'm Stuart Jackson, and I lead the technical team for UPL. UPL manufacture, research, and market various crop protection products and biostimulants and biological fungicides and insecticides across a whole range of crops, not just core arable crops, but also into horticulture and amenity. So it's a wide spectrum of products, and we are a team of 5 covering the UK. And my interest in being here tonight is to work towards more sustainable farming practices, particularly in sort of the core arable production systems, and moving them into the 21st century in the future, proofing those production systems.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stuart. And finally, Tom Gill joins us from the Arla Food Group. Tom, what is your job there?
Good afternoon, Hugh. Good afternoon, everybody. So I work within the global agriculture team at Arla. My role is focused around farm sustainability engagement and collaboration, working with our owners and colleagues and stakeholders working all across our markets, which covers the UK, Central Europe, Denmark and Sweden, to support and help our farmers on their sustainability journey, Hugh. So thank you very much for being here, and looking forward to being part of this.
Tom, thank you very much. And thank you all 4 of you for joining us this evening. We're going to be running as normal till around 6:15. As I say, please put your questions in the chat box on your screen. Any thoughts you may have or any new questions that you may wish to add to the ones that we have. And also, just to let you know that this webinar will be available as a podcast in the future. Should you log off tonight thinking, damn, I missed that bit and I really want to listen to it again, it'll be there forever in perpetuity. Right, let's get underway. Matt Bloom sends in number 1 question, and I'll put this to Thomas first. Is there a risk of becoming indebted to the companies that pay the farm carbon for carbon credits in the future, when there may not be enough carbon credits to go around, including for the farm business's own use? So is there a risk, Thomas, and this is something that you guys do, you effectively pay people the carbon that they put into their soil year on year. How do you, I suppose it's a bit like leveraging your business, isn't it? Not borrowing too much. How do you work that out? And is there a genuine risk there of something going wrong?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good first tough question as well. We like that. So so we work with farmers in 17 European countries. We've got more than 1 million hectares on the program. We've paid out more than 6 million euros in the last few years. So we've got some experience of this. The important thing to say is essentially there is no risk. So what we do is we run everything on a yearly cycle, and we're only issuing certificates based on the practices and the actions that have already happened on that field. So what that means is we're not kind of predicting what might happen in the future or how that might change. We're working on the actual quantification that's already happened in the past. Obviously, different schemes and different programs will be different, but it's very important when you sign these contracts to check how it works with that specific provider you're talking to. And if you're talking to us, please ask our team those questions.
So effectively you quantify what's there when you go in there in the first instance, presumably physically by seeing what's in the soil and then putting that against the various metrics for various crops, so you know what you're going to have to play with effectively year on year.
Yeah, so what we're really doing is so if we take a kind of concrete example, there are farmers that signed up for the 2023 harvest. We're now kind of collecting their post-harvest data results, so what yield did they get, kind of all of that stuff. So we're not predicting what they're going to do in 24. We're understanding what they've already done in 23. So that means there's kind of no extra, there's no comeback essentially, because that has already happened. There's no sort of ambiguity.
Tom, is this something that troubles your dairy producers? Because clearly it's a very different kettle of fish to if you're just a straight arable farmer who's got a fairly linear system year in year. How much wheat you're growing, how much of this, what your soil carbon is. This is a whole different kettle of fish when you've got a farm with a load of arable crops, but also a load of dairy cows stood on it. That's a big challenge, isn't it?
I think there's a lot of challenges in this, Hugh, and I probably there's a key part about kind of learning from other industries that within agriculture that are moving already. So I think there's a relevance to the work that Agrina are doing and the expertise that Thomas has. But I think there's also a point about the measurement and quantification that farmers are working to. I see a lot of questions coming from our farmers across all of our countries, wanting to understand both in terms of the practices that they should be taking first and foremost that support just being more resilient to the climatic changes. And all of the parts of Europe particularly have suffered extreme heat and extreme wetness, so to speak, over the last sort of 6 months, let alone in a shorter period possibly. And from those practices, it's then that reward and value, and we're not quite in a place where we're implementing something in that arena as yet, Hugh. But clearly, it's a direction that we kind of need to move in, and I think finding a freer way that we can learn and be transparent about methodologically about the way those things are working is quite important. We're part of an initiative linked to the IDF that's going to be quantifying and working to this, but the level of data and information they're working back to, but also the implementation of an action, say planting trees or putting in different kind of margins or actions within a field, the level of permanence that a farm is working to in order that change is gained and grown. It's something probably I'm interested to kind of learn and understand from, let alone how our farmers are working around all of this information at the moment. So the short answer is it's complex.
It is complex. Stuart, is it something, you're dealing, you've got lots of people working with you, but you deal across a whole spectrum of different crops and crop types. Is this something you're seeing more and more when you're dealing with clients and you're out on farm, that people are effectively getting involved with people like Thomas and trying to really get a handle as to what's happening with the carbon in their soil?
Yes, without a doubt. See, more and more the trend is towards growers, whether you're a core arable or a horticultural grower, working with another body to help and guide them through various steps and hoops and assessment methodologies they need to put in place. And in particular, it's not the grower's expertise. The grower's very good at growing the crop or managing the system he's under. It's always better to look to an external consultant when it comes to these sort of things to understand they've chosen the right path for their particular system. It's very important.
Yeah, and then we moved to red meat in Wales. Rachel, very different to farming, big arable crops in Lincolnshire, where it's not easy. None of it is easy. I should emphasise that, but you could argue it's a slightly more predictable scenario than trying to make money out of suckler cows and lambing sheep on a Welsh hillside.
It is, and actually it's very different, and I suppose it's refreshing to see that, in terms of agreeing on that sort of annual basis, because what we're actually seeing at the moment in Wales is much, obviously, because we're predominantly, sort of grassland, trees, and peatland would be the main three sources, and actually some of the peatland restoration projects are tying people up, for decades, 30 years, and actually that's where the real risk lies, I think, at the moment. Whereas that additionality that sort of Thomas talks about is much easier to be measuring and capturing on an annualized basis, which I do have some concerns when we're talking about decades, and actually especially these are legal contracts that people are entering, and quite often they're on farms where people haven't even undertaken their own carbon footprint for their own system. So it's a little bit of sort of horse and stable, I think, situation that perhaps we're coming across sometimes in Wales. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, across the different sectors and also the different areas and topography in the UK, actually how it's so nuanced in terms of how this whole carbon agenda will have to evolve according to where you are and how you're farming.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's quite complex, which leads me seamlessly on to Ross Alexander's Davenport's question, who says, clearly the products the farmer is producing, such as milk or meat, are not carbon neutral. Brackets yet, some may be, to be fair. The companies buying these products are already trying to reduce their value chain emissions. How does selling carbon credits generated from the farm separately from, for example, as he puts, the milk and meat produced on farm fit into this supply chain? Now presumably I could carry on growing if I had spare headroom with carbon, I could either add the carbon, offset my own production, and say, here's a premium product, which is, a net zero milk or something. Or I could just produce my milk, it goes into the normal supply chain, and then sell any spare carbon elsewhere. How does that, how would you decipher that relationship, Rachel? How do you untangle it? Or not, as the case may be?
And actually, it's very complex in red meat. So, obviously, sort of in the dairy sector, like with Tom, it's much easier, actually, in many respects, because the supply chains are slightly more linear, whereas actually they're much more fragmented. Especially, we have, we've got a strong sort of suckler and also store lamb industry here in Wales as well, where again, you're adding another sort of link to the chain. So it's very fragmented. But I think that there's several points I probably want to make around this. First of all, is that we need to remember, and I'm a farmer as well, I should have probably declared that interest at the beginning, is actually we're uniquely placed here. We are one of the only industries and people that can actively both store carbon, but also sequester it. We mustn't we mustn't lose sight of that actually, in many ways, we are control of part of this game because of that. But also, more importantly, it's about understanding that we are amidst a climate crisis. It is serious. And actually, we've got a role to play because of what I've just said. So I always think the key thing for any farm, no matter what you're producing, is first of all, measure your carbon footprint. That must be your first port of call. Then look at how you can reduce it. And that's when we start, after you know what sort of position you're in, then you see if you've got any capability, can you inset it in your supply chain? And that's what I'm a fan of. Why would I want my carbon credits to go to aviation when they could perhaps go to my own sector, my own industry, underpin my own Welsh brands? And then you might look to sort of offset if you can't be insetting. So for me, it's about always having that mantra: measure, reduce, inset, offset in our minds as producers.
And does that, how does that tie in with Tom, with what you do with your supply chain? Apparently your supply chain's simpler and more linear. It is, actually. Well, it is. I get that. You're not selling a store sheep or a store animal, or a suckler calf goes from one farm to the other. But in terms of what you guys do, Tom, how does that, where do you see that value? Where is the value of reducing the carbon over and above the fact that we have, as producers, these targets that we've got to hit for 2050 for net zero? But as me, if I'm producing milk for you, how do you reflect that value in that supply chain to me?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I would align, actually, despite it being easier, as Rachel says, in dairy. I think there's a real totally connect from the farmer's angle to it. Understanding and working with the base that you're operating to, and we've been working with our farmers for 4 years now to help them and support them in that direction. And now we're starting to be on that journey of helping them identify and incentivize where to place those actions, both in terms of contributing to carbon reduction through various practices that relate to that. And then also then starting to look at the carbon farming, the biodiversity agenda, which is clearly growing and vitally important, because we recognise clearly that we're in a difficult times for biodiversity loss and nature restoration need and water quality pressure too. But coming into it, working with our customers, I think there's an element of working with them to understand both in terms of where their motives and imperatives are for what they're trying to achieve, and then relating that in terms of being a farmer-owned cooperative. And clearly there's a real base here of value that the farmers want to be reflected and rewarded for. And I think that's not necessarily directly answering your question, Hugh, but how do you value some of this, and where does that benefit come from? And that's a challenge.
You've got, just in your Arla supply chain, you've got a couple of levels that you can run at. There's the standard sort of Arla Garden level, or you go to Arla 360. Do you ever see a time where, as a consumer, I can walk into a shop and buy something that, I don't know, a net zero can of milk versus a bog standard can of milk, and pay an extra quid for it or whatever it costs, which goes ideally back to the producer?
Yeah, certainly for our farmers, I think they would massively like that to be seen, wouldn't you? And rightly so, because there's a challenge here to understand what different products kind of mean on the shelf, and there's different ways that's trying to be worked to for the value and recognition that farmers like ours are putting into this. But there's also a question of the willingness to pay of customers and what they want to engage and understand on that journey. And it feels like we've got a lot of work to do. And I don't just mean that as an Arla comment, I mean it as having been around the industry for a while, to get consumers to recognise that this is important, and that organisations, our farmers, are totally committed to being on that journey with them.
Thomas, you're effectively selling carbon credits on behalf of predominantly arable growers with your system. They're doing exactly, aren't they? They're selling their wheat one way, or whatever they're growing, and then you're selling the carbon credits to the bloke down the road doing MOTs, or whoever's buying it, non-related to the product. Do you think is that the way it's going to go forward, or are you going to have to, or might you guys start selling a totally net zero wheat product, for example?
So this is a beautiful question, and this is like a bit of a misconception, I think, of the industry that I'm in the carbon farming industry, right? So we essentially run a program where we work with farmers to help them understand their carbon, potential, essentially, and obviously audit and verify and issue certificates to a standard. What the farmer chooses to do with those certificates is completely up to him. We obviously will give him choices. If he would like to sell it, there's an offset market, this is how much we can pay, etc., etc. But if he would like to keep it, if his supply chain would like it, whatever he wants to do is completely up to him. Our job is to work with him to be able to issue to a standard. And I just want to reinforce again what Rachel said, right? I think we're only just starting to understand the value that farmers have. There's no other industry in the world that can store carbon like we can store carbon in soils. And everybody else in the world is very, very quickly starting to pick up on that, and they're very quickly going to start to come and ask for that value. What I'm really passionate about is farmers need to understand what, in money terms, that value means to them on their farm. And once they know that and they're educated on, this means 20, 30, whatever, £30,000 to me annually, then you can make business decisions as who's going to be the best buyer and what's the best use of this product, etc., etc. But until you get some sort of base understanding of what this means to me on my farm, you're kind of shooting blind. So this is why I'm really excited, really to work for a greener, because we can come and tell you exactly how much it's worth. And then if you think that's a good value to sell it, wherever you sell it, it's completely up to you.
But presumably, so potentially there could come a point where, do you fear that if the kibosh, but the pressure comes down the agricultural supply chain, or the authorities say to farmers, everything you've got to do is you've got to balance off. Does that impact you in the sense that there won't be this spare carbon for you to potentially trade for those farmers should they choose to get you to do that? Effectively, you just effectively become a monitoring service as opposed to a brokerage.
Yeah, so we run two services, right? We run a full MRV monitoring, reporting, verifying service where we issue a certificate. And then the second service is essentially the optional services. If Mr. Farmer, you would like to turn this into cash this year, we can obviously brokerage that for you. But that kind of core MRV process is what we're good at, what we've done for a long time. And whether it's the supply chain that asks for that or whatever, it kind of doesn't matter too much for us. But what I'm really passionate about is the control of this asset should be in the control of the farmer, just like it's in his control of where to sell his wheat. And every year he can decide who's going to pay him the best value. And, Tesco's will have to open up their checkbook.
Yeah, well, that's what might happen. I mean, it takes us on seamlessly to Tom Sedan's question. How do you accurately measure, track, and then improve soil content on farm? Stuart, what's your view on this? There's a myriad of... if you start from the beginning, just carbon footprinting the business before you get into the soil, there's a myriad of platforms. When someone says to you, what should I do, Stuart? How do I get my head around this? Where do they start?
I think, the key thing is they need to have a good understanding of their business and their systems. And essentially, they would be better off approaching a third party who fully understands the various tools and systems that need to be implemented, the modeling that needs to be put in place, and the true accounting of the business right through the chain, because it's not just the basic aspects of the business in terms of the growing of the crop, it's the whole infrastructure of the farm as well. So my advice to them would be, right from the start, it would be better off to approach the likes of what Thomas is doing in terms of the monitoring and taking on that side of the business for the farm in terms of understanding what the farm is doing and then helping the farm to progress to a better system and a better process. I generally, that would be my advice to people, is to go outside of the business and approach a consultant.
And if I'm one of your levy pairs and, I'm running a relatively modest sized business and I may not have a lot of cash to go and spend on external consultants because I'm not in Lincolnshire. No, that's just But if what's your advice to your producers, where they're trying to make the thing pay, particularly at the moment with the pressure that's on and what's happening on the support side?
That's it. And I suppose, and it's always been, having, previously worked as a consultant actually across the UK, it's always been the envy of most farmers across the borders that we've got Farming Connect here in Wales. And I think, with our own resources at HEC, but also the availability of consultants or specialist advice via Farming Connect, there are options for all sizes of farms in Wales, I think, which is really quite good. And it's just that stepping stone then, isn't it, to get them on this agenda, to give them greater understanding. And I think, but without that big initial outlay, because, for a lot of farmers, they're feeling, especially here in Wales, they're feeling, under pressure financially. The uncertainty is not helpful. And actually having to then perhaps invest on their own is quite a big challenge. So we're quite lucky that there are plenty of ways that we can work with farmers here in Wales that perhaps don't cost them the earth to get that initial bit of advice.
What do you say to your dairy? A lot of your dairy suppliers now, Tom, will be on this journey anyway. But initially, what was the message in first cost effectively starting to get their head around the carbon content of their soil or just the flow through their business?
Well, I think to be a little bit poke the bear, so to speak, a little bit here, I'd say, to be fair, in dairy and livestock, I think we've been a little bit slower than what we should have been for adopting better soil management, soil health, to be honest. I think it's an area which supports as much around our nutrient management planning as it does in terms of actually contributing towards, building and storing kind of carbon in the soils. But and to that end of bringing, we've got some really leading farmers and we've got farmers who are just getting on that first step. We've been putting in place some kind of training programs. We've run both physical and online events to bring some experts together, to a bit of Stuart's point, just so the farmers can understand like a vest test for just feeling and smelling and touching the soil and the value that brings. But then also through the incentive model, encouraging them to take and submit soil sampling how to take soil sampling, understand the difference of measuring in grassland as well as the cropped area that could be producing maize or whole crop or what have you coming back into the winter feed ration, and then encouraging them to understand the different testing mechanisms that are quite varying, to be fair, between all of the different countries that I'm working across, and that they know what those metrics actually mean and contribute to, because it is such an important resource that the farmers are working with, that many of the times of unlocking that potential, it's the broad spectrum analysis as much as it is about building organic matter that's critical to unleashing better use of land use, and reducing fertilizer use and maximizing those organic slurries that we know are very positive to nutrient health.
Thomas, look, you do this all the time. So back to the question, which is to accurately measure, track, and improve soil content. It's about measuring soil carbon. Is this a lab thing, Thomas, or is it the satellite thing? Because we've done both on this farm and a myriad of both. What is the most accurate way of doing it, would you say? Because you've done a lot of it now.
Yeah, so I would say, so there's obviously two ways to do carbon. there's the kind of hardcore soil sampling laboratory, as you said, or there's the kind of more computer-based model type algorithm, right? They're just the two ways to do it. Both of them, in honesty, have good bits and bad bits. So the smart people have to use a combination of both, which is what we do, and I think probably what most businesses do, really. So yeah, essentially we run both systems. When the farmer comes and interacts with us, they will kind of be part of our model, and we'll run some estimates based on that. But we do run obviously a full soil sampling program, across all the countries we work in, which is expensive, but it's really, really important. So the simple answer is you can't really do one of those things. You have to do both.
It's a hybrid of the two, until such time as someone comes up with a wonderful technology and a simple metric that we can all abide by. Gosh, wouldn't that be easy? Wow, a global standard. Right, let's go grass farming. Edward Perkins, who is where is he? I can't see where he is. He's put a question in. Do we know how much carbon is captured? This is the paternal one. By pasture grass. Rachel, because apparently, according to the House of Lords report on grazing and carbon about 6 or 7 years ago, the grass in Wales sequesters more carbon than the grass in England or Scotland. And the Scottish grass, the stuff in England, according to that report, didn't sequester any. What's your answer now, Rachel? How much carbon does grass actually put into the soil?
Well, that's God's own country for you, I suppose, isn't it? Don't mention the rugby, though. That's the only thing. No. No, do you know what? It's a really good question. And I think I'm sure all of us on this webinar have that. If we had £1 for every time we hear this question, but unfortunately, there's differing schools of thought. That there's people that think we're completely over-egging the custard in terms of grassland's ability to sequester, and there's people that think that it's the sort of the silver bullet, so to speak, in terms of our problem. So the truth is, I believe we need a lot more R&D and proper investment in this area. I actually think, and this is probably from how we sort of work at HEC on these, what I would view pre-competitive. So it's not about protecting our brands. It's completely pre-competitive things. We need to work together, actually, globally, I think, to really try and understand what the true capacity and ability of grasslands is to sequester effectively, because we need to know. It's not about it's bigger than carbon credit generation. This is about sort of mitigating climate change. It's serious. We need to understand whether we're chasing the wrong thing or not with this. So I feel like I haven't really answered your question, Edward, but hopefully you understand that it's so complex. But actually, I think we need loads more cash and big brains sort of pumped into this. I mean, Thomas is nodding, so that's good.
Thomas is nodding because he wants to. But I mean, there's this theory, isn't there, that you've got this sort of bathtub scenario, and with grass, you can leave a lay down over, say, 10 or 12 years, and it might fill up the tub, and then it'll actually put no more carbon into the soil. Is that fantasy or fact, would you say, Thomas? Or is that part of what we think we know, but actually we don't know any of it?
Yeah, so my expertise is in arable. So first of all, just to declare, I don't only have any grassland expertise. The only thing
If none of your farmers got any grass in their rotation to better
we
enhance
only
their
work
soil
with
carbon.
arable. We only work with arable crops.
Right. Okay.
Is obviously something we're looking at, and it's part of the future. But I would agree, we started with arable crops because there is a lot more research, understanding, and information. And grassland is the kind of next one to come. I think the thing I would just say is in the kind of credit world, there's this thing called additionality, and the tricky thing with grassland is there's how much carbon is already stored. Are we already at that peak? That's the kind of question, and I don't know the answer. But that's the question that keeps coming up when kind of grassland is discussed. But I don't know much about it, but I'm sure we'll look at it in the future.
Yeah. Tom Gill, Arla must have the answer to this question. Come on.
We have answers to lots of things, Hugh, but I think there's some fair points that my colleagues have just mentioned. But at the same time, we do know a bit of grass, and I think there's just to throw in a few different things. So I'm here in Ireland at the moment with doing some exploration with Teagasc, and they gave a figure this afternoon of some measurements that they've been taking off some of their demonstration farms, and they've seen on some of their grassland areas, permanent grassland areas, some with herbage incorporated and some not, where there's 0.5 ton of carbon being stored per hectare per year. So that's a good indicator, and that's coming from actual science and research. But then on the flip, I'm aware of some work that I think Aberdeen University were doing, linked to some work the NFU were running back in the first lockdown, and they identified this plateauing effect. But that plateauing is probably quite relevant to the soil types that different farmers are working with, particularly in grassland. And I know the Regen pilot work that we're doing, and we have about 24, 25 farms within that network, and a mix of conventional and organic systems, all building up very good learning and expertise from it. But we've seen that within clay soils, there's real potential to draw down and add more carbon, understanding both the active carbon that's in the top 15, 20 centimeters, but then how do you start to incorporate more diversity, different types of rotational management systems to create deeper roots to draw down that carbon into the soils. And I think it goes back to Thomas's point earlier, really, of different techniques to understand the benefits of different actions, but we need to find ways of sharing that information that brings that improvement action that farmers can take in different situations, because no two fields are the same.
No, exactly. So you were saying on my rubbish grade 3 Surrey green sand, it's hopeless trying to fix any carbon. We've only got a little bit of clay. Stuart, what's your understanding of this? Again, you're predominantly dealing with arable crops and horticulture, and even amenity. I mean, have you looked into this, or do any of your clients ask you this question?
No, it's not a question I generally get asked. If in my day-to-day job, it's core arable cropping I get involved with. But at the end of the day, even if you take a core arable field, there is huge scope to bring grassland into the rotation. And even if there's a limit as to what the grassland can actually put in terms of carbon, you take most of the core arable farms, they are way behind in terms of the carbon that could be potentially stuck into that soil. So the key thing from my point of view would be to bring some grassland into that rotation. Straight away they'll see benefits in terms of the soil health and the structure, and also the carbon sequestration as well. So it'll take them many years to get to the point where it does plateau. So just bring the grassland in, and that'd be the best starting point.
Yeah, and obviously we see it'd be interesting to Tom when your data starts to come back on some of your mixed species, the herbal lays as they're commonly known, supposedly super good at firing carbon back into the soil. Felicity Stiles, who's from Frontier Agriculture, she's the Sustainable Crop Production Project Manager, and she has sent a question which is a bit topical. Given what's going on in the world of Red Tractor and NFU and that whole assurance arena, she basically says, do you think the time will come when assurance programs such as Red Tractor will ask for carbon footprints? Well, they're sort of starting to now. And when these, basically what she's saying is by declaring your carbon footprint at farm level, does that negate any of the private sale? I mean, we've sort of talked about it earlier. I mean, Tom Gill with Arla, I mean, do you see that? Because it's back to this thing. Do you see that becoming a prerequisite of producing into a chain so that your customers know exactly what's going on with their Scope 3 emissions? That we are ultimately going to end up going down that route. There is no getting away from it, because how else, if you have to accurately calculate your Scope 3 emissions for your business, say as a retailer, and if you haven't got a Scooby, what's happening with all the guys and girls producing your products? How can you do it? This is ultimately going to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of why colleagues made the foresight that they did a while ago, and our business has been on this journey for a number of years, both voluntarily in the early 2010s, and then it's become much more harmonized and integrated across all of our areas. And I think the reality, we've got to try and own this space as best as we can from the context of what we do, because our farmers, we're part of a cooperative. It's partly about, we've got to be returning that kind of value, but it's also about being responsible and taking action to recognise that if we don't take the action here, it could be imposed down, and we don't want that. We don't want that to happen. And by developing it and being quite transparent and clear about what we share, it can help grow and deliver that value that hopefully our customers see of all different shapes and sizes, that we're being committed to what we said we'll do, which is a 30% reduction of our Scope 3 by 2030. That will be reviewed relevant to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol update that came out last year, and that work's ongoing at the moment. And then obviously working towards our targets of 2050. So it's about that responsibility. Absolutely, Hugh.
It's quite. I mean, Rachel, how do you? I mean, do you see this becoming a point where everything has to be declared down the line, so that processors, so that retailers, and it's the same, wouldn't it be? Even if you were a direct seller, if we were all to hit net zero by 2050, and I keep referring to it as the cup of political cold sick, which someone in power is going to have to hand out to the general populace. Everyone has to offset if we're going to hit this. So that means that if you are in a supply chain, you will have to declare everything that's going on so that everyone knows what their numbers are. Do you think that's inevitable, Rachel?
I do. I actually think as probably producers, it's going to be our license to operate in the future. But actually, I think it's quite easy to separate the two as well. I don't see that we're necessarily going to have to be giving away our carbon if we're lucky to have a sort of a deficit on farm to our supply chains. I mean, I think there's an opportunity perhaps to inset and sell it within that supply chain. But I think it goes back to my initial sort of mantra about measure then reduce. It's about reducing the impact of the product on farm, and actually. And the way we're moving here in Wales with red meat is that we start to underpin our PGI Welsh lamb and Welsh beef brands by having a lower carbon footprint, because the way we farm, because the way that we sometimes thankfully have a maritime climate, where it means it's raining a lot, and actually we can produce red meat in a really efficient and climate friendly way. So I don't think that we're necessarily giving anything away, but we have got to probably wake up to the fact that we will have to have this information. It will probably have to follow our products down the supply chain, whether that's through stalls or whether we're selling directly, just so we can operate. And I think we can never lose, again, as I said it before, and I've been a broken record on this, it's about not losing sight of why we need to do this, that we are amidst a climate emergency. It's not a trend. It's not to make money. It's because this is really serious. And actually, we're seeing impacts all the time in terms of extreme weather, in terms of human migration, conflict. That's all climate driven. So I think we need to sometimes remind ourselves of the why as well.
Thomas, we're going to have to get, though, so much better at judging what's happening in our businesses, at measuring this flow to effectively validate, isn't it? Because at the moment, there are so many different platforms you can use. There are so many methodologies. When you sell a house and you say, I want 300 grand for it, or whatever. You don't go and say, well, I might have 316,000 this week, and next week it's worth 180 because he valued it. I mean, it's bonkers. There is no. Would it help if there was a general standard across the board, standard methodologies, standard protocols within sectors?
I think it's really interesting because the carbon market's come a long. So there's kind of 2 points to make. The carbon market's come a long way in the last few years, and you know, they're often people say, just like you said, oh, everything's so variable, everything's so different. It's not really. If you look at carbon, you know, carbon footprints, carbon programs like ours, we're all, you know, fair. If we, you know, took the same farm, took the same data, etc., we're not too far out from each other. It's not that wild. It is not that like mad. We're all on the same page. We're all coming from the same, you know, research studies that have been done, etc., etc. So that's the kind of important thing to say, is it is fairly consistent as it stands now. The other important thing to say is I think it comes back to kind of what I said before, is, you know, we need farmers to understand what's happening on their farm, to be in control of what they're doing. And the whole point of the carbon markets, the whole point they exist is to finance farmers, well, whoever they're financing, but in this case, farmers, to get to net zero. We need to get to net zero as a planet. Farmers need to get on that journey. We know it costs. We know a transition to regenerative practice costs money. You need to buy a new drill. You know, there's a yield risk in the first few years, etc., etc. And the whole point of carbon markets is to help you get over that hump to a net zero position. So this, I think people have this kind of perception that the carbon markets are like this external thing that's coming and disrupting everything. They're actually bringing finance directly to the people that need it to get them to net zero in a supply chain. So, you know, we're really, you know, it's kind of a good story that this is happening and money's coming in.
We just got to work out just somehow finalize and validate the rule book and where the flow is. And more importantly, presumably, because as a producer, I don't want to miss out on the premium at the retail end if I'm a million miles from my end consumer. And this is one of the fears that's about there, isn't it? If you put a green tick on a box, Mr. Retailer or Mrs. Retailer come along and put the green tick on, and the person that feels good, they've got plenty of money here in Surrey, oh, I'll buy that. And they charge 10% more. It's the same product, but it's got a green tick on it. What's it cost them? A bit of green ink, and the producer's not seen the return. So we need a far more sophisticated data flow to enable that to happen, don't we? I mean, is that something that you pick up, Stuart? Again, when you're talking to many growers, we've got to get better at quantifying this, haven't we? And working out how that flow works.
I think that's one of the key things is growers need some reassurance that they're being compared on the same standards being applied across the board. So when they're comparing this crop with that crop, they can understand that they're using the same models and the same systems, and they're coming out to a same standard. And then if we've got a standard in place, there's confidence that actually what I've measured is correct. It's correct. Whoever I go to or whichever model I use is giving me the same answer. And then it's about how then, depending on where they're going up the supply chain. And I do think that's the right thing for to move towards a supply chain, so that actually you're putting your carbon with your supplier, where them down to the market, and ultimately then the consumer could then have choices as to which way they want to go. But importantly, that value has got to come back down the chain. It can't stop at the top of the chain, and then just the same prices apply. I do think the consumer then would get the choice. The supplier, in terms of the final retailer, has the confidence and assurance of what they're purchasing into the different outlets. And importantly, the producer at the bottom end is playing on a level playing field in terms of the modeling he's applied, and then gets effectively the return back for his investment to move in a particular direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Critical.
Yeah, it's got to work. And the problem is it's so varied, because historically you could say we've done that with organic. You had organic products and standard products, and organic producers, certified organic, and generally, not always, but has generally been paid a premium on that for the differential in it. But this is a far more complex beast, because you need to know the numbers going in. So if my wheat's going into the supply chain at one end with X on it, or my beef is, am I going to get I should get more out of it than the person down the road?
Absolutely, you should get a proportion.
Doing a poorer job, for example,
paid relative to the level of carbon you are using to actually grow that end
That's
product. Yes.
it's a big that's a big system. We could be
yeah.
here all year discussing it. It's perhaps something that needs some leadership from people far greater up the legislative tree than us five and everyone else on the call, unless we have any ministers on the call, in which case please do chip in, and if you've got any ideas, put them on the chat. One just to run in, actually Esther has asked a question. Tom, with regard to Arla, do you allow Arla farmers to generate carbon credits and then sell them outside their supply chain and not to Arla?
So at the moment, there may very well be farmers who are doing and trading what they're doing, but at the moment, it's not something that we've particularly moved in. We obviously want to work with our farmers to understand and quantify that, and probably most crucially, understand that part of the story that's not currently showing within the carbon footprint that they're doing annually. But we're working, as I said earlier, with an initiative that's quite collaborative across the dairy industry, linked into the movement of the methodology by the International Dairy Federation. And we're trying to understand what that means by pilots and testing, and we're going to do more of that next year, with a view then that maybe from 2025 this becomes a more solid component of our climate check work. But as I say, farmers may be doing it. I don't know, but currently it's not something that we're engaged.
There's nothing in the contract that says you can't. There's nothing in the contract that says you can't do what you like with your carbon credits, which is good. Let's move to something slightly different. Back to the please do continue to send in your questions on the live chat and any comments you may have, because it's great to hear from you. We'll go back to the pre-submitted questions now. Sophia Chin writes in to say, I've been approached by a couple of large businesses wanting to buy land to plant trees. Is the demand going to grow? And so the terms will the terms become more favourable with time? What are the hidden concerns in these deals? Rachel, Wales is rife with little men in smart suits wandering up farm drives saying, have you considered a lifestyle growing trees and not having to deal with these horrible sheep and cows? What's the deal, Rachel? What do you tell people when they say, should I sell out to the tree people or should I keep farming cows?
Oh, do you know what? I suppose this would probably be an old consultant hat for me, and it always depends on sort of, what's your business desire, isn't it? What do you want to do? There's nothing wrong with exiting agriculture, and I always think that's really important, isn't it, in terms of advice. And that's fine if that suits you as a business, and if so be it. If you want to go for the highest bidder, and that might be well for someone to plant trees, then so be it. But my advice generally really is obviously, Forest in Wales and for HCC, it's absolutely fundamental that we maintain a critical mass of livestock going through our whole sector. We've got to, because it underpins a massive food and drink industry, underpins a rural economy, including the Welsh culture and language. It's very important. So my advice is, and we have seen, and no doubt that probably will be, you're right, it will be an area that will grow. But I think it's really important for farmers to look at your land, not be scared of trees. Actually, how can you integrate trees on your farm? And whether that's in small plantations of dodgy wet corners where things get stuck, banks where you can roll the tractor, or whether that's much bigger, more ambitious projects. But I think, again, it goes back to the point earlier on, actually farmers were uniquely placed here. There's only a definitive amount of land available. We can't make more land. So actually, if there's opportunities, why don't we grab them rather than let someone else grab them? But also, let's be smart here. Let's see how we can stack enterprises. How can we still, produce food, but also incorporate trees?
Very contentious in Wales at the moment with the 10% figure that's being bandied about. Perhaps someone needs to tell the Welsh government they don't make land anymore as well when they're coming up with their policy. Thomas, do you think, Sophia says in her question, is the demand going to grow and will the terms become more favourable? Do you think the value for taking land to plant trees, obviously in the initial first few years, not much carbon is laid down, but when we get into year 15, 20, boom, it really starts to cook, doesn't it, in terms of what it can suck in? And ultimately, surely the price of carbon is going to go up. It's only going to go one way, isn't it?
So, if you ask me what the wheat price is going to do, right, it's the same question. I don't know. all of the indications are obviously that the climate is becoming a bigger and more important thing, and therefore we need to do more and more for the planet, and therefore the incentives to do those things will increase. So kind of all of the academic information shows that the carbon market is growing very rapidly, and therefore the price will grow. Obviously, I wouldn't don't like hold me to that. Obviously, it's like anything's up and down. But I think the really important thing, she asked about, are these good deals and what to look out for? I would definitely echo what Rachel said. It's just about context. It depends where you are in your business. It depends, what the value is that you're hopefully looking to get. It depends what you're doing. But what I would really say is, if somebody's coming and knocking on your door because they want to make it happen on your farm, then there's some money in there somewhere. So I'm sure you can find a way to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, do you see it as Tom Gill? Do you see it as an issue going forward when you're, trying to graze your dairy cows around the trees because people have been sold these amazing packages to grow trees on their land? Oh, you're muted, Tom. Oh, you're back now. Oh no, you came.
Sorry, my internet dropped out.
Oh, there we go.
I said I was just saying there. I think we all like the idea of cows in trees. There's some benefits to grazing that from dealing, I think, with some digestive issues, but that's maybe a little bit outside my territory. But I think to a bit of Rachel's point before, I think the idea of sort of stacking enterprises, I think, really sits. I think even if you viewed this as actually take the trees away, what have we seen with the integration of different renewable technologies onto farm? We all have those areas of the farm that are difficult to manage, and we need farms to deliver different services in the future. And one of those things around dealing with difficult areas that produce diffuse pollution can suit well to tree management. But it's not just about trees. I think they get a little bit demonized, but equally we get a bit overexcited about maybe what their whole potential is. And we need to look at it on a landscape scale approach, working probably with farms clustered together as much as what that individual enterprise can deliver. But it absolutely can work together. It's just thinking maybe just a little bit of a mindset change going forwards.
Stuart, the tree people, have they been to Lincolnshire yet and started knocking on your clients' doors saying we need to plant more trees here?
I think without a doubt, I think there is a lot more opportunity to plant trees. If everybody looked at their farm, they could find areas where it's more appropriate to put trees in. You've only got to drive around here as of last Friday when we had nearly 2 inches of rain. The amount of wet places and wet corners of fields where we've been farming them historically for many years, and they are better placed to be doing something else, which would have a lot better benefit in terms of the overall farm system and the farm business. Rachel's absolutely right. There are right places, and we can all, take out those wet areas, square the fields off so it's more efficiently to farm. But it does come back to, I suppose, the individual and what they want to do. They could put it into different sort of grass margins and graze them and do all sorts of different things. But you have to sort of like sit back, and I think everybody could find somewhere where they could put some trees in, which have an overall benefit to the farm.
Yeah, no, it's going to be an ongoing thing. Obviously, there's a government scheme, tree planting scheme for English farmers. Obviously, the Welsh government have got their own ideas about tree planting schemes. Not sure what's happening north of the border in Scotland. Let's move on to another question. This is from James Fawcett. If keeping carbon in the soil requires continuous no-till, what securities are there against future tilling? If the land is tilled, won't the carbon be released back into the atmosphere and all the hard work is undone? Thomas Gent, do you have a strict, okay, you guys are going year on year, aren't you? But what's to stop someone from doing a fantastic job and then releasing a whole load of carbon, and then you pay them to put it all back again when they didn't need to release it in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the sort of the important term in carbon markets world called permanence. And it's very important when we show to buyers, that it's one of the key questions they ask is how permanent is this carbon storage? So it's kind of a big factor that affects the value. The tricky thing that we have to manage, right, is the buyers would love, 10,000 years of permanence, and the farmers would love flexibility every year to do whatever they want, right? So these are the two things that we have to sort of manage. it took us a long time to get to where we are, but we now can manage a program where we deliver the full permanence to the buyers that they need under the methodology that we run, and then also the flexibility to the farmer to be able to do kind of yearly practices as they choose. It's quite sophisticated how we operate that, but there's essentially a buffer mechanism, as well as we do calculate the emissions from tillage activities. We obviously own an MRV service, so we're continuously monitoring the fields every year. And we say essentially we take account of those emissions that could happen from the tillage and kind of factor that into the risk. But what we do know is when a farmer properly transitions to regenerative farming, the kind of financial benefits really do stack up, and it's very rare that you find a farmer that goes fully back to just being a conventional tiller, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's no securities as such, but so there's securities in individual contracts or deals you might have with people, and that's in the contract. But what you're saying is the overall benefits mean that you're unlikely to do that unless there was some severe, I don't know, you had to plough to get on top of blackgrass or whatever that issue, might be. I mean, Stuart, would you happily, if I gave you 1,000 acres and said, there you go, Stuart, crack on, farm it away, but you can't ever plough anything again, might be, maybe, may not be some blackgrass there, and the likelihood is you're not going to have anything to spray it with. Your hands are a bit tied behind your back, aren't they?
I think that is my concern. That individuals are going to have to look at that and decide how long they want to sign up for. But my concern would be to keep as much flexibility in there as you possibly can, because we all know what happens. Blackgrass will get out of hand. There comes a point where we need to do some different types of cultivations in terms of maybe ploughing it down one year when it gets out of hand. We do get the wet autumns, which does change the systems we need to adopt and put into place to get the crop in the ground. And there will come changes in the farm's business strategy in terms of bringing in different crops which require cultivations to different depths, particularly if you're going to be a root grower of potatoes and carrots and sugar beet. You are going to have to do different depths of cultivation. So I would urge people to look at the length of the contract they're signing up to and build in the flexibility for them. And only they can make the decision as to what degree of flexibility they would like. But if they are on land which has got blackgrass in it, they are going to need to keep themselves some flexibility in it.
Yeah, definitely. It's a harsh one to get on top of. They say if you stand in the same field long enough, nothing ever changes, and it's could be quite true with the plough to a certain degree. I'm just going to go to another question here. This is one for Rachel, and the rest of you can chip in on it. Jonathan Harrington says, how can we ask the taxpayer to fund these exercises? So talking about SFI and sort of incentives to be carbon positive or farm in a positive way, when there are little or no immediate benefit to them. How do you justify that to the taxpayer of Wales, Rachel, when some of your guys are using Farming Connect or getting a grant for this or a grant for that?
It's a good question. It's a valid question, but I think my response is probably going to be quite blunt, though. And I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record because I've mentioned it twice now, so we're going for a full hat trick. But actually, we are amidst a climate crisis, which is intrinsically linked to a nature crisis, which fundamentally will impact the human race if we do not act. And I think actually that the money that is going into it is actually quite small if you think about the potential return on investment in future, because the most serious threat to food security, for example, is climate change. So I think it's quite small investment now will hopefully make us much more resilient. And I know it sounds big to talk about human race level stuff, but I think this is, sometimes I was thinking, it's bigger than me as a farmer. It's bigger than Welsh government, on Westminster government. This is global in scale. And actually, I think we should probably put a lot more taxpayer money into sorting this out, if anything. So it feels a bit soapbox-esque, so I'll probably step down now, but that's probably my quite blunt answer with it.
Tom, would you say the same thing in terms of we just need to get on and incentivize every which way we can to get on top of this?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Rachel's saying. I think this is what a lot of people a lot cleverer than me have been trying to answer for a very long time. And the challenge would appear to be that our powers that be struggle to reconcile these things, or a more immediate priority kind of comes along, which is as equally important, but I was reading recently that probably the government would have committed to, Henry Dibbleby's report had it not been for the Ukraine problem kind of kicking in. And I think we just don't value food high enough in this country. We've lost a connection between rural and urban, and we need to reconnect people to what this delivers, because aside from any of the carbon farming benefits, purely the national health budget is driven very intrinsically as well to issues that are created by what people are consuming, and we need to connect people better to that. And that's all of our responsibility. It sits with each of us individually, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thomas, do you want to add to that? Are you happy that the taxpayer is funding some of the actions that are incentivizing your growers to do the right thing to give you some carbon to trade?
Yeah, but what I would say is what we really see is, there's a huge amount of pressure on the public fund, right? There's a lot of things to do. And so there is a risk that the public funding, slows down or, disappears even. But I think I'm going to say it again, really, but why the carbon markets exist is to bring that private funding in to make to incentivize farmers to do the stuff we want them to do. So, what I really see it is the public and the private sector need to work together, because they both bring a significant amount of money to be able to make these actions happen on the ground.
No, absolutely. Just a few follow-up points. Patrick Hancock, who is from the Mendip Hills AONB, he's a farming engagement support officer. He says, surely it's not about being able to add a premium on your product. Every business, not only farming, will have to account for their carbon footprint at some point. The sooner a business gets to grips and understanding of their carbon footprint, then the better position they will be in. CG, just calls himself CG. What percentage of consumers actually spend the money in the same way they answer surveys? From organic figures, it looks like not many. Right, a few comments there. Thank you. That's just come through on the text. I'm going to go to, there's a couple of questions really, which sort of tie in, and I suppose it's spooling back to sort of beginner's stuff. If you're new to this or trying to get your head around this, whether it is, as Will Osborne says, would like to know more about carbon credits and how to claim/sell them. Roma Braithwaite says, what schemes are available for carbon farming, please? Thomas, again, and obviously you're going to put your company out there because that's why you're here. But equally, if I'm a complete carbon virgin coming to this market, where do I start? I mean, there's people everywhere shouting at me. Where's a good place to start?
Yeah, I'll try and put my independent hat on as much as I can. What I really think is the first thing you need to do as a farmer is understand your position, right? So what assets have you got? Have you got a grassland? Have you got some woodland? Are you an arable farmer? That's the first thing you need to understand. You then need to go and look out, who. Really, what I would say is this is a complex sector, and so take external advice. Go and find those right people that know about that specific thing that you're interested in. So let's take the arable, I'm an arable farmer, for example. Obviously go and speak to economists and people like that. Most of them are aware of this sort of thing now. And then come and talk to I'm sure, hopefully they'll recommend companies like us or, some of our competitors and find the sort of deal that works best for you, really. So I guess my kind of underlying thing is to understand what you've got. Go and speak to some external experts to advise you which are the best companies to go and approach. Go and approach those companies and have, grill us, ask some really tough questions about how this could work on your farm. And then that last thing is, the devil is in the detail. Make sure you read the contracts properly. Make sure you understand exactly what you're signing up to, what you're committed to, all of that kind of thing. And make sure you understand what, the company that you're signing up with is committed to delivering back to you.
What's the general advice you give producers, Tom, when you're talking to people on farm?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first thing we really do is it's quite hard to talk about hypotheticals. That's the first thing to say. A lot of farmers want to know, okay, how much could this mean to me, right? And it just depends on so many different factors. The first thing we do is we say, let's just do some calculations together. We're not going to charge you for this. Let's just work together and so we can get a proper estimate of what this could be worth to you. That's the first step we run. And then the second step is obviously then the more contractual discussion of this is the deal that we can deliver to you, obviously read the contract properly and decide if this is open to you. But that's the first thing I would say is it's quite hard to talk about hypotheticals. Just get some calculations done by some professional people for your farm, and then you can really understand if this is something that's worth looking at for you.
Which sort of takes us full circle back to where we started, when we started out, when you were saying get some consultancy. You've got to make some effort there. Tim Fanshawe, who is a Natural England senior advisor. Good evening, Tim, has just sent a message saying, and he would say this because they have facilitation funds, but no, he says there is convincing evidence that groups of farms set up through countryside stewardship facilitation funds are more likely to deliver improvements in nature recovery and habitat improvement than people doing it on their own. What is the view of the panel with regards to the role such farm group facilitators could or should play in carbon trading? So Tim's absolutely right. If you join the dots in terms of nature recovery and habitat, you can make a big impact on the landscape. Thomas, if someone comes to you with 3,000 acres or 50,000 acres in a landscape saying, hey, do they get more bang for their buck? Are they likely to be more successful, do you think?
I mean, it depends on context so much. It depends what they've been doing in the past and what their soil type. There's so many different factors. It's always really hard. This is why I said it's really hard to talk about hypotheticals. But absolutely, if there's a group together of kind of, interested farmers that are all on the same page and, they're all interested in this sort of thing, it's obviously a lot easier for us to facilitate a kind of group working towards what they want to do. There's also the interesting aspect of when they've got those kind of carbon credits together as a group, that could be very kind of interesting and valuable for one of the buyers to kind of be part of a group and invest in that. So I would say potentially it might increase the price, but it's definitely an interesting thing to be part of.
Definitely something there. Edward Perkins sent one of the pre-asked questions in. If land is let out, who controls any carbon developments? Rachel, this is a big problem for tenants, isn't it? Because potentially it's not in the 76 Act or the 49 Act or the FBT Act of 95. What's your advice to people when you go onto a tenant farm and they want to get involved in carbon and they can't?
I mean, it's going to be very subjective according to the agreement between landlord and tenant. I mean, that's always going to be because it's a legal relationship and it's understanding about how that interacts. But actually, this is where it's quite useful in terms of, or actually where it starts to separate, but useful in terms of sort of Thomas's model, where it's sort of like multi-annual perhaps agreements, as opposed to where you've got 30-year agreements on peatland restoration, for example, becomes much more complex. So it is a big challenge for the tenanted sector, as I think probably agri-environmental policy now sort of post-cap across the UK is, I think, in terms of perhaps where we're seeing both in terms of public markets, but also private markets going. But it's all going to be dependent on your agreement and your relationship. And I suppose it goes back to that, especially with carbon at the moment, how we start to demonstrate additionality and actually who's doing that. Is it that management practice that's been undertaken by the manager, which could be the tenant, for example, whereas perhaps when we get into tree territory, peatland restoration territory, it does get much more complex when it's more longer term.
Presumably, Thomas Gent, most of your clients are owner occupiers, are they, or do you have a mixture?
Definitely have a mixture, and to be honest, there's not a kind of hard and fast rule. So the first thing to say is, we need to work with the person that has farming management control on that farm, right? So the person that decides what crops are growing and whether they're going to grow a cover crop and all that kind of thing, because they're the ones that need to be incentivized to grow the cover crop and to reduce the tillage, etc., etc. What we of course say is everybody needs to be on the same page. So if we're speaking to the landowner, if we're speaking to the tenant, they need to make sure that they're talking to each other and have an agreement between themselves of how they're managing this. Absolutely, like Rachel said, it's kind of a little bit easier in our situation because we're not doing, decades and decades of contracts. So yeah, that's how we operate. But yeah, if you're going to plant loads of trees for 30 years, then that's the landowner really needs to be involved in that.
Tom Gill, how do you see the tenant? I mean, it's always an issue, isn't it? Depends on the tenancy agreement, long-term investment, whether that's around dairy infrastructure, whether that's around what you do with your carbon and what your long-term goals are. It's more of an issue here for tenants, isn't it? The carbon thing, the soil thing.
Yeah, I think there's probably going to use the word a bit of a helplessness. I would imagine that some tenant farmers are kind of feeling about both the expectation that's being cascaded down in terms of what they deliver, and we could relate that into kind of clean air strategy actions that would relate, say, into the dairy side of things, and their ability to either they want to move, but maybe the landowner doesn't want to, and equally there'll be landowners who are moving that might kind of catch the tenant farmers on the hop, and there's almost a need here for that kind of sort of system that's kind of bridging between, to just allow some level of action and mediation of different levels to just bring people together to develop a longer term approach, even if that's maybe like 2 or 3 years, let alone something to Rachel's point that's looking 10, 15, 20 years ahead, because it's such a fast moving pace, and it must be quite unnerving for them, I would expect.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's the government, current government's move to look and review things within the tenant sector, and it is a complicated and it will no doubt be a long and rambling road, unfortunately for the tenants, probably not for the landlords, but certainly for the tenants, until it's resolved. And the best bet is probably just to just sit down with your landlord and go through it, or vice versa if you're coming from the landlord perspective. Final question comes from Elizabeth Allen this evening on the text. Elizabeth Allen Freer, and she's a rural director. I'm not sure of what. She says, I'm struggling to find the balance between achieving our own net zero in farming practices and the financial benefit of carbon offsetting for private corporate net zero. Can both objectives be achieved? Rachel, is that possible to do both, do you think, on a Welsh beef and sheep farm?
Absolutely. It's so system dependent, though. That's the key here. It's all about the system, and it's all about the management of that system. And I'm not saying that extensive equals good, intensive equals bad. That's not the case. That's not what we see. But it's how that system is managed, in terms of how you can balance, in terms of reaching net zero from a farming point of view, and then having anything left over in terms of selling it on the market. But I think a key thing for me, and this still surprises me, and this is why I think sort of in terms of carbon, it's really important, almost that myth busting, because everyone has a chat down the market. When it becomes Chinese whispers, it's understanding that when you do have ruminants, you have carbon emissions. And I think sometimes something as basic as that still isn't quite understood. So it is possible, but it can be a challenge when you have ruminants. It very much depends on how you farm, the land you have. Are you lucky to have a peatland knocking around, or can you plant 100 hectares of trees, for example? So yeah, it can be done, but it's not necessarily easy, should we say.
Are you using GWP star or GWP 100 just to really confuse the calculation as well? Thomas, presumably it's easier to do. Nothing is easy, I should reaffirm that. But it's back to this where we started at the beginning of this discussion, didn't it? Where you've got more linear arable systems, annual systems. Are you able to do both with your clients?
So this is, again, maybe a little myth-busting misconception. The whole point of these two things, getting to net zero and carbon markets, are absolutely from the ground up designed to work together. The whole point of a private voluntary carbon market is to incentivize the project owner, whoever it is, in this case a farmer, to get to net zero. And the way that we do that in agriculture is to implement more regenerative practices on an arable field, right? Reducing your tillage, using cover crops, etc. All the stuff we know. So that's like there is no kind of difference. They're designed to work together. A carbon market funds a farmer to get towards net zero, and then once they kind of get to that net zero position, obviously that is kind of then they need to decide how they want to use that credential, if that makes sense, if the supply chain is going to value that or not. Who knows?
It is possible. Tom Gill, is it going to be possible to do both in the dairy sector, do you think?
Absolutely agree with what both panelists have said before. I think my message would be, I think what we've reiterated a few times so far is encouraging farmers to own it, from measuring it to valuing the actions that they take, and where they're selling and committing into programs that support that transition journey but it all starts with what we want to own to take those actions.
Yeah, it starts with exactly take control of it. The industry needs to take control of it across the board, whether it's the accreditation, the farm assurance. We need to take more control of it and stop standing on the sidelines as everything waves by, or we might see it wave off into the distance. There you go, industry. Take more control of it. Look, we hope tonight has been useful for you listening in. I would like to thank very much. Our hour and 15 minutes is about to expire. Our panel this evening. Thomas Gent, thank you very much. Stuart Jackson, thank you very much. Rachel Madley Davis and Tom Gill, thank you so much for taking time out to join us tonight, wherever you happen to be. As I said before, this evening's webinar will be available as a podcast, so you can spool back and listen to the bits that you may have missed and wanted to really listen to again. Thank you very much for taking the time this evening, Tuesday evening, to join us, and we look forward to seeing you. I will see you on Friday on the Farmers Weekly podcast, and we will see you again for another Farmers Weekly transition webinar next month. But until then, thank you very much and have a good evening.